I believe that we are ready to start with today's agenda. Thank you, Imamdin, for recording the session.
Yes, please.
So thank you again. And Amar, would you be starting or I'll start?
Sure. Got the agenda on the screen here. So following this introduction, we're going to have 5 minutes presentation from each one of our discussants introducing themselves and their research. Following by this, we're going to have a presentation from us, the CAS founders, and then we're going to have some critical commentaries from all the discussants, 15 minutes each, followed by an open discussion for all of us to contribute. So I'm now going to pass it on to Imamdin to introduce our discussants.
Exactly. Just first of all, a warm thank you to all the 3 discussants who read our essay draft that we have sent them beforehand. So the content that we're going to present today. So as you're going to see, we have Dr. Sarah Meny-Gibert she's program coordinator at the Public Affairs Research Institute in South Africa. She did a lot of research on public organizations, particularly in South Africa. And what caught our attraction is that she has a kind of this historical lens about how history can explain the formation of the state, the formation of certain public sector organization and reforms. So that's caught our attention because we also really want to understand the local context. So really intrigued to hear what she says about our ideas. A second professor, Griffiths, who was professor of anthropology of law at the University of Edinburgh. I didn't know before that this kind of exists, but intrigued us quite a lot also. She does research on anthropology of law, comparative and family law, particularly African law, gender, culture, and rights. And she did a lot of exploratory research, ethnographical research, amongst others in Botswana about the Kotla system. So a topic that we also want to raise in our presentation today, and that's why we're also really looking forward to her inputs. And finally, Rebecca Namatovu, when I wrote her a couple of weeks ago, she was still a doctor, and now I think we can congratulate her that she has become assistant professor at the Department of Strategy and Innovation at the Copenhagen Business School. So really congratulations from our side. A lot of research on entrepreneurship, also in the African context. For instance, in Uganda, she looked, amongst others, about how religious beliefs influence, shape entrepreneurial behavior. So I think that goes exactly in the same direction, the same mindset that we try to raise here. And also she's looking at grand challenges. She, amongst others, editor in the Africa Journal of Management special issue on investigations into the COVID-19 pandemic and management in Africa. So I think we have 3 really interesting discussants sharing similar mindset as we do. That's why we approached them. We're really happy and really thankful that they took the time to be here to read our essays beforehand. And as I said, before we start with our presentation, we want to give quickly the stage also to them to say a word, talk about their research and whatever they want to talk. So maybe let's start with in order. So with Sarah, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. I work at an institute based in Johannesburg, South Africa, called the Public Affairs Research Institute. We are affiliated to the University of Witwatersrand, and we do research around the nature of the South African state, mainly. We have done a bit of work on other African countries, and studying its sociologies and its histories and why it isn't working the way we would like it to. And then we also get involved in advocacy work around changes to relevant pieces of legislation or reframing the way a particular problem is understood in the public domain. We're a bunch of social scientists, so none of us actually come from a public administration background. We have anthropologists, historians, sociologists, geographers, and an economist. So the Institute was set up primarily with the idea of bringing a kind of more social scientific lens to the study of public administration. In South Africa, historically, the study of public administration was very much tied to the apartheid regime. And so it was an attempt to, and a lot of the more kind of progressive or left-leaning scholars were not studying the public administration. So it's an attempt to try and build that field in South Africa. That's it. And my own interests lie in the histories of, public service reform. And I also have done my PhD on politics of governance of public education and union-state relations. So yeah, is that sufficient for?
Thank you very much, definitely, or probably not, but let's move on. And anyway, I'm sure we have also time for questions if there are particular questions raising to you. So we're going to use this time. And please, stage is yours.
Hello, as Emmeline said, I'm a professor of anthropology of law emeritus at Edinburgh University School of Law. So I think I'm maybe only the trained lawyer among you, not sure. Well, anyway, over the years, my research has focused on anthropology of law, comparative and family law, legal pluralism, African law, gender, culture, and rights. And really what draws all these fields together is studying law from an anthropological or social scientific perspective based on ethnographically grounded in-depth field studies. And I focused on this because this perspective highlights people's understandings, experiences, and use of law in everyday life in order to focus on social persons' perspectives on law, rather than simply looking at what law in the book says, working from the top down. And my approach provides a counterpoint to textual and doctrinal analysis of law promoted by formal models and challenges presented by conventional legal theory. And it does this by extending the scope of what constitutes a legitimate focus for legal inquiry. Now, I've worked for over 30 years in Southern Africa, starting with setting up the law department at the University of Botswana in the 1980s, up to carrying out field research there on family disputes and access to and control over land. And I'm interested in moving out of conventional tropes. So in my research, even on families, I draw together the threads of public and private dimensions of social life. So my work has not only contributed to feminist scholarship on law, but also to broader debates in the social sciences concerning the relationship between law, power, and discourse, which I think this center is very interested in. And the work highlights the importance of law in an interdisciplinary context that has an impact on transnational issues such as human rights. It contributes to debates on globalization and access to justice that seek to reappraise the relationship between international, regional, national, and local arenas, and the effects of plural legal orders, both within and across these domains. I've taught at the Southern and Eastern African Regional Center for Women's Law, SIACL, for many years at the University of Harare and at other universities, including the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. I've taught on the master's program at the International Institute for the Sociology of Law in Oñati, Spain. And most recently, I've been teaching law, culture, and rights in a transnational world, the anthropology of law, and gender law and everyday life at the Institute of Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin. I've been affiliated through my research with the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle-Saale, Germany. And my most recent book is Transformations on the Ground, Space and the Power of Land in Botswana. It was published in 2019 by Indiana University Press and forms one of a number of books that were part of an international project on framing the global. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Really interesting, all the different stages, and we're really happy that you're here with us today. And finally, I give the word to Rebecca.
Spoke without my microphone. Yes, hello everybody. So my name is Rebecca Namatovu from Copenhagen Business School, currently an assistant professor. Previously, I was working as a senior lecturer at Makerere University in Uganda. And my research really lies at the intersection between entrepreneurship and development studies. I mainly focus on social interactions among actors and how this affects their entrepreneurial activity. I have done extensive research in mainly East Africa, that's Uganda, Kenya, and on occasional situations, I've worked in the DRC and in Nigeria. And while there, I basically work within the informal sector, look at how informal firms, which we all know really are very perverse in the African context. I study how informal actors behave and how they venture into businesses. I have looked at sectors like the cross-border trade, where we have communities that tend to be marginalized. My work also is motivated by what I like to call entrepreneurship in difficult settings. And by difficult, I look at things like entrepreneurship amongst the poor people, or people who have come from war or post-conflict areas, where I'm looking at refugee communities and other marginalized persons, and oftentimes these will be women. So I tend to really work around that space and try to, one, highlight the kinds of environments such actors have to work in, or what these environments, how these environments influence what it is that they do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for your introduction. Also really interesting. We move on now, and this time we kind of turn a bit the table. Usually when we invited 3 speakers to talk about their inputs, and as it is today, a wrap up from the previous webinars, it's mainly we 3 who first talk and then get the discussion afterwards. So please, Omar.
Thank you, Amandine. So as you can see this slide here with the grand challenges, the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, of Agenda 2030. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You've seen all these, and some of you are perhaps actively researching and addressing these. What we're seeing here is that no one size fits all. What we have to appreciate, though, is some of these goals are, of course, common. They do require to be differentiated and localized to our various contexts. So, for example, one approach that may work in Europe may not work in another part of the world. Of course, the example we're going to use here is the pandemic. Lockdowns with accompanied economic government assistance worked relatively well in the West to slow down the pandemic, but such approaches may not have worked as well in African countries, which relied more so on an informal sector, where there was less opportunities to create a laptop class, as it were, and to be able to work from home. Next slide. So with this in mind, a few of us got together. So we had a reunion, in fact. So myself, Amar C, my colleague, Adila Kodabaks from Middlesex University of Mauritius. We joined forces once more with Amandine Forum from KPM Centre for Public Management, University of Bern, and we connected over Zoom, and we started to discuss some of these things, the approaches that we're witnessing. And we had previously collaborated when Amandine was a research visitor here at the university, and we previously ran some research-oriented seminars. So we started to think about how we could get some discussions going again, similar like we'd done before. So we discussed the government responses around the pandemic, and based with our interdisciplinary backgrounds, bringing together digital technologies, international relations, and public management, we decided to create the centre, which eventually became CASP, to investigate smart public value governance, specifically within the African context. And this was established in September 2020. With the ambitions to get scholars talking and discussing, raising awareness as well amongst students who may be interested in studying this area, to collaborate with like-minded individuals and organizations, and to at some point run short courses to further raise awareness amongst other things. So we started off with this webinar series in 2021, and this is our fourth webinar, culminating and basically summarizing all those previous webinars that we've had, and we're looking forward to the insights to help us guide us further in our mission. So I'll take you through some of the webinars that we had. So the first one we had was in April 2021, and this is a topic on public value governance. The speakers we had were Professor Jacob Torfing from Roskilde University, Denmark. He presented a talk on public value management as a game changer. Then we had our own Professor Lauren Pesh from Middlesex University in London, and he discussed the principles and values of good governance in EU internal and external policies. Finally, for our April 21 webinar, we had Kelly Culver from the Culver Group in Canada, and she gave an overview on public value governance and practice across the Commonwealth. Following that, we had another webinar in July, our second webinar, and this looked to go deeper. We wanted to unpack the African context, and within that we had, again, each webinar is a series of free speakers. So first off, we had Professor Joel Peffello from Concordia University in Canada, and he presented Far From Void, How Institutions Shape Growth in the Informal Economy. Following this, we had Camilla Rocca from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and she gave an overview on the assessment of governance performance in Africa. Then we ended this webinar with a talk from Dr. Folashade Sulukundu from University of Oxford, and she presented Unpacking Africa-BRICS Relations, a Focus on Agency. Our last webinar looked into smart government. So this was our theme for the final webinar, and this was in October 2021. And we had, again, free speakers. Professor Tobias Mettler kicked off from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and he presented Smart Government, Where Did We Start and Where Are We Heading? Then we had Professor Mogopodi Lukorwe from University of Botswana, and he elaborated on the digital divide and the implications for smart government in Africa, specifically the case for Botswana. Then finally, we had George Kalibala from Wawi, South Africa, and he gave us a talk on a purpose-driven approach to digital transformation of government. So I'm now going to hand it over to Adila, who's going to take us into the insights of each of these free webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. And yes, so that was a brief overview of how we started. And yes, it was an idea during the lockdown, and we are trying to see how our respective disciplines, we are from different research backgrounds. I am a lecturer in international relations. My interest as well is in world politics and matters of African governance. Amandine, his area of expertise and research is in public sector administration, and Amar as well with his background in digital technologies. So with our three different backgrounds as well, we were interested in combining the topics and seeing how they overlap. namely around topic of creation of public value governance and how it's adapting or adjusting to smart technologies and so on. So the aims of the webinar was for us actually to see what research is being done out there, and it was very broad, as you can have an idea from all our speakers and the different themes that we have addressed. We were very broad. So we were interested through the webinars we had organized to gather expertise, experts' perspectives around themes of public value governance, the African context, understanding African context in regards to public sector administration, and of course, understanding what do we mean by a smart government. So when we look at the three different webinars, they seem disconnected. But actually, that was the point. We were trying to find whether there were overlaps in the discussions that we were having. And even if you're watching our previous video records on YouTube, you may be asking what's the relevance at all to the work that we do. And in fact, this is where the fourth concluding webinar of our series comes in, where we are summarizing the key insights and using those insights as well to offer a suggestion as to what the future of smart public value governance can look like. So joining these topics, we have found that there are sub-themes actually that we can extract from the discussions, namely around the use of public value governance, but not just public value governance, but actually embedding smart public value governance as an approach to tackle grand challenges. And we have seen as well among our speakers overlaps in the way that they talk about the topic, even though they were coming from different disciplines, from different research backgrounds. For example, co-creation of public values, that was heavily emphasized actually among numerous of our speakers, but namely in the first one with Professor Thorfinn, talking about co-creation and reminding us that even though public sector administration started in Western origins, give the impression of a very top-down model, actually, in the 21st century, the expectation is to have a more horizontal approach to the topic, involvement of stakeholders, not just in the public sector, but as well in the private sector and civil society. And that was a comment as well, which was echoed through the work of Professor Laurent Pech as well, where even though he was talking about the European Union context, but reminding us about the relevance of open dialogue. And here, reminding us of representatives from different sectors in society to be involved when addressing grand challenges. But moreover, through our different discussions as well, we've had the focus on local particularities among different African countries. Of course, they are distinct, but there are some commonalities as well, which can be obstacles on how to achieve smart public value governance. And they are not obstacles necessarily every time, but they are in fact, particularities of local context to be mindful of when we are thinking about the current situation of public sector governance in the African context. For example, we had the mention of informality. So the informal sector, how do we account for that in this reality of governance and the future of governance? And we've had Professor Mettler as well, highlighting that the evolution of ICT has been in different phases, from the evolution of e-government in the 2000s towards digitization of the public administration, then 2010, the focus moving towards open government and virtualization of the workplace. From 2005, the focus 2015, the discourse shifting to digital government and the development of ecosystems. and from 2020 onwards, arguably the shift or a turn towards smart government. So we've had the other experts as well contributing their views about the possibilities to design more intelligent governance approaches by making use of new ICT, such as the work of Professor Kalebaila. And he provided examples of how these technologies could be used to improve public transport services, education, or healthcare systems. And finally, another very prominent theme as well in our webinar series has been around listening attentively to the African context. In other words, not just importing models from elsewhere and just expecting it to work. So it's about being mindful of local particularities. It's about understanding local context, also understanding that there is a possibility of partnerships as equals between African partners, African stakeholders, and overseas collaborators, even in the ICT sector, or even when thinking about how to improve public sector administration. So in a nutshell and very briefly, these were the sub-themes that we have gathered from our webinar topics and that we are reflecting on as well in our essay. And using these different thematic understanding on the topic, we are here now to offer an idea about the future of smart public value governance that would work for the African context, hopefully is ideal for the African sector. So Emamdine would be reflecting on that part of the discussion. So the stage is yours, Emamdine.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So considering that on the one hand side, we have a lot of advantages that the concept of smart public governance can offer, but also these local particularities, especially kind of is a resistance to collaborate. Some actors might lose their face or believe that they kind of lose power. We have a lot of diverse ethnologies, ethnies in the African context that are really strong and sometimes hinder to think beyond the ethnic context, what would be relevant from a public value governance perspective. But also digital divide, that is an issue. People don't in Africa have different kind of access to internet, mainly, for example, via smartphones. So in kind of make it happen, we argue that future research should focus on an Africanization of smart public governance. Why do we believe this? And I think there are particular two minds and philosophies that come in mind and that shape our thinking, which is amongst others Felwine Sarr, who wrote a book about Afrotopia. Of course, there's similar books also. We picked him now for this presentation. What he's saying is that when we ask kind of young people, African people, what should be the future, how should the future of Africa should look like, he says that they're also often presented kind of Western visions. So the Western goals are emphasized. And he say that that's kind of the main issue that hinders the development of African countries. So he argues that there need to be a focus on Africa and African values to define what kind of how Africa was in the past as an idle place, and what could that mean for the future. And in that sense, he talks about an Afrotopia. So as said before, it's not just kind of a copy of paste of what is there. It's really kind of going back to the roots and from there develop new ideas, a new perspective for Africa and Afrotopia. At the same time, having discussed also a lot of advantages that we heard and seen about smart public value governance, but being aware of the challenges that it might have for implementing them, we kind of raise another philosophy and discussion that shapes our mindset, that is often phrased by creolization. You know, creolization in many countries, amongst others in Africa, also in the Caribbean countries, where kind of this phenomenon has occurred or is occurring. It's a mixture of cultures that we can see, for example, in languages, that we can see in music, where African, Western, Asian cultures, beliefs, roots, etc., are kind of mixed and are establishing something new. So Edouard Glissant, a writer from the Caribbean, raised this concept of creolization and contrasts it also to globalization, kind of globalization, which he understands as a global structure that is dominant above all other cultures. So we have McDonald's everywhere and they look everywhere the same, as a simple example. However, creolization, he defines it as it is the beginning into contact of several cultures, or at least of several elements of distinct cultures in one place of the world, with the result of a new datum totally unpredictable in relation to the sum or the simple synthesis of these elements. So the idea is really kind of bring different ideas together, make something new about it. And this is kind of the thinking that shapes our outlook for future research on smart public value governance in the African context. So there we are saying, let's see what African philosophies, what African histories and system can tell us, what can it teach us, and how it might be combined with the concept that mainly has risen in the Western countries of smart public value governance. We bring here some 3 examples which are not definite, just kind of start the discussion, raising ideas, where we say that could be a path to go for future scholars who are interested in such an approach. We have chosen these 3 philosophies and systems, which is the Ubuntu philosophy, the Asuvada theory or principles, and the Kotla system. The Ubuntu philosophy is particularly common in Southern Africa. Nelson Mandela, somebody who is said having practiced the Ubuntu philosophy. So it's values practices the people of Africa or African origin view as making people authentic. So it's a really strong philosophy, and where we see resemblance and possibilities for symbiosis with the concept of smart public governance is that the Ubuntu philosophy understands the human being as a part of a larger and more significant relational, communal, social, environment, and spiritual world. So considering that smart public value governance raises for collaboration, and kind of saying also kind of a similar principle from another approach is also taken by the Ubuntu philosophy, could be a start for future research and understanding how an Africanization of smart public governance looks like. Similar as with Asuvada theory, the Asuvada theory was raised by a sociologist, Akinsola Akiwowo, who also fought these ideas that fighted against the ideas that theories based mainly from Western context are applied on African countries. And that's why he kind of said we need to take indigenous theories from Africa and look to them, to the society, or also to other societies. So based on a poem actually from the Yoruba culture, so people mainly from Nigeria, he started to elaborate in sociological theories about what could that mean for African cultures, but also for the rest of the world. And also here, there's this belief in the Asuvada principle that there's a necessity to associate or coexist by internalizing and rightly exhibiting socially approved values of community survival and development. So also here, actually, we see that this idea of collaboration, of thinking as a community, is actually really really strong within African cultures, which kind of also contradicts that, as we can see, that the African smart public value governance has difficulties for being implemented, because some people might face a losing of power in such a new system. And the cultural system, as we have already mentioned at the beginning, particularly popular in Botswana, which are public meetings in the community, which are as a council, they work as a council, as a court system, but also to make decisions, to find consensus. So it's also said sometimes that it's the oldest democracy in the world. And also here we see possibilities to understand, okay, there is the idea of finding consensus. So what could that mean also for the concept of public value governance? And why we believe it would make sense to do it, mainly for two perspectives, more from a practical perspective, that it might help to implement such a concept of smart public value governance in African countries. It might be better accepted by citizens, by public officials, because they see it differently. There is this idea, for example, in robust design strategies, that saying when you want to introduce something new, a new idea, it makes sense to mix it, to bring elements in it that are familiar to the people who want to use it. So that would be one aspect, so to raise the acceptance, but also to improve the understanding for the aims of a new public management approach. So I say it shouldn't be just kind of to copy paste what is done in Western countries, to copy paste those countries that rank high in a global rating, because they're saying you need to have, for example, in smart government, you need to have some nice web page and web page applications that would make sense, considering that most people have access to internet in Africa via smartphones. So it would be really kind of studying the aim of it based on African cultures and African ideas. And then it's also a question, of course, of identification with the new public management approach, which is particularly relevant when we consider that such concepts and such systems, they are never a status quo, they are dynamic. And if you identify with such approaches, then you will be much more eager also to innovate, to try out new things and adopt it even better to local context to make it happen at work. And on the other hand, we believe it could be interesting also for a theoretical perspective. So when you're studying smart public value governance and combining it with Ubuntu philosophies, it could be a new understanding, for example, about how trust building processes could work, because that's really relevant in the Ubuntu philosophy, raising trust. Considering the Asawada theory, it could be another additional understanding for the need of collaboration. So kind of defining better why collaborating, not just only because we want to do it, but what can you make for the community, as it is raised by the Asawada principles. Or when we consider the cultural system, it could be an interesting approach to understand how consensus building processes could be improved, could be more efficient, more effective, by studying exactly such cases and implement them to the theoretical concepts of smart public value governance. So I say that's kind of the idea that drives us to continue research, do further research on an Africanization of smart public value governance. Here just some three ideas. There are of course different philosophies from the African context could be taken. So it's really just kind of making ideas develop. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And as said, we start with the discussion, while we start first with the discussants, and then we will open it and also open for questions. So I think we start with the order that we had from the beginning. So that would mean with Sarah. We're happy to hear you.
Thanks very much. Just often still takes me minutes to unmute myself, despite having done this for 2 years. So I haven't got a PowerPoint presentation. I have written something up which I could forward to you if you would like it in writing. So my understanding of your project or the work of the center is that you are centrally focused on developing context-specific research and proposals for the application of public value theory or public value governance and smart government to the challenges of governance and public administration in Africa today. So that was the starting point. And my understanding, I mean, I come at my response, my discussion as a social scientist, so somebody who's primarily studied sociology and political studies, science, comparative politics. So my understanding is that public value governance emerged in part as a kind of response to this inevitable pendulum swing of ideology, so from traditional public administration to new public management. And whilst there was clearly a need to update our theoretical tools and our understanding of public administration, you know, since original formulations by Weber or practitioners like Wilson, new public management in some critiques threw the baby out with the bathwater. And it emerged as overly focused on questions of efficiency and sometimes the inappropriate sort of application of business and market theories to the study of public administrations, which were driven or underpinned by a different kind of structure and ethos. So my understanding is that it aims to kind of invigorate or reinvigorate the theory and practice of public administration by putting the ultimate aim of democratic public administrations at the center, so the creation of public goods and public value. And in the context of liberal democracies, this also means a special focus on meaningful public or stakeholder participation. So democracy is more than access to the ballot box, but the co-creation of solutions to complex problems. And that public officials will support or interact with relevant networks of stakeholders to co-create those. So in that sense, my understanding is it's not dissimilar to new public management's views on decentralization, which were posited as something more, you know, something more collaborative and embedded that could generate more locally appropriate policy and solutions. So just to give you a sense of my understanding of those concepts that you're using. So my sense is that it's a highly appealing as a normative framework, and this constant return to the central purpose of bureaucracy as public value creation and twinning this with a commitment to democratic practice is potentially creative and provides a sort of animating idea for your center. But I think that the concepts of public value governance and smart government, especially, but not only because they were primarily developed in the global north, don't offer sufficient analytical tools. So in some sense, your paper suggests that you're starting with a solution, public value governance and smart government, but it's not yet clear what the problem is that you want to address. And you're at the beginning of this journey, so I assume that is part of what you will be sketching out. So my sense is what is needed, and you may be developing, it is a sketch of why many governments in Africa have been especially poor at providing public value for citizens, and why democracy is so especially fragile in many countries. So as a social scientist, I have drawn myself heavily on scholars in the field of political economy and comparative politics, and anthropologists who've taken the study of the public administration seriously. So here I'm thinking, for example, of some of the work of Olivier de Sardan and colleagues on West African bureaucracies. So I think that a more grounded sense of the structure or structures and institutions that are generating problems for or blockages to the kind of bureaucracy that you have in mind when you foreground public value governance. And then from here, this kind of statement of governance challenges in countries in Africa that you're interested in, from that sort of statement of what some of those structural causes might be, then the next move, I think, is to work the ground up. So to develop empirical cases from which to explore some of the concepts and tools of public value governance and smart governance and how you could apply them. So your choice of empirical case study will be really important. Otherwise, the conversation remains highly abstracted, which I think is a critique that could sometimes be made more generally of the study of public administration, is that it can remain highly normative and abstracted. And the test is really to develop the sort of empirical body of work to explore these in quite tangible form. So I was just thinking, for example, around this concept of smart government and how some of those kinds of ideas have been applied in South Africa. So you all note in the paper the challenges provided by the digital divide in many African countries, although this gap is reducing, and there's a lot of innovation demonstrated in expanding access to information and choice via cell phones at the moment. But a further challenge, at least in South Africa, is that the innovations in digital technology and software that can potentially expand access to services or enhance democratic participation or enhance organizational efficiencies, etc., my sense is that they're likely to require certain kinds of governance prerequisites or institutional prerequisites. So, for example, the South African Revenue Collection Service is a positive case in point. The Revenue Service in the mid-90s to early 2000s was really innovative in the way it reorganized its own systems. So its leaders used the latest in IT systems and business process engineering to make tax compliance far easier for citizens. And then they twinned that with some very kind of creative campaigns, which built on the legitimacy of the new apartheid, the Mandela-led government, to develop the ethical case for paying tax. And these two together, this kind of the social campaign and this sort of careful use of IT systems and to enable taxpayers to pay tax more easily, not just those with access to excellent internet connection, really paid off. But these innovations at SARS were built on certain institutional characteristics. So SARS's legal structure, it's designed very differently to the rest of the public service in South Africa, helped insulate it from political interference for a period of time. Even that was eventually undermined under the Zuma administration, and a whole lot of those leaders were removed, and friends of a patronage network were put in place at the revenue services. But originally, that legal structure helped sort of insulate them, and they happened to be staffed by very savvy and smart leaders who focused on building kind of in-house IT capacity rather than outsourcing it. And South Africa was starting to outsource a lot because it had taken on board quite seriously the new public management discourse around outsourcing government services. So they didn't do that, and as a result of that, they built some very amazing in-house capacity that won awards for innovations in the use of IT infrastructures and systems. But then in other parts of the South African state, the governance and administrative challenges are so severe that my sense, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm understanding smart government too narrowly, is my sense is that those challenges are so severe that smart government innovations would be quite difficult to implement. So, for example, in the Eastern Cape, which is one of our poorer provinces and largely rural, district education officers who are tasked with planning for resource allocation for a very fragmented and large school system, serving people that are on the move. So it's a province where there's massive out-migration, there's urbanization. So they've struggled to kind of connect, get the data they need to plan for the schooling system. And then they designed, I was linked to a team that designed all these amazing little mapping tools, and they co-created these mapping tools with the district officials so that and they made sense to the officials in terms of the work they needed to do. But then what happened is that the majority of these officials don't have regular internet connection and don't have access to the data interfaces that they were designed for. And the reason they don't have access to that was because contract management was being handled so badly in the supply chain function in the education offices. And that was in turn the result of procurement fraud. And the central state and the provincial treasuries kept closing the taps, freezing the budget, and then cancelling supplier contracts because they suspected corruption in those. So in other words, they were sort of just the basics of having access to cell phone coverage, to IT infrastructure and everything was hampered by the governance environment. It wasn't so much a digital divide, it should have all been there and the organization had the budget to have it, but the governance environment and sort of administrative dysfunction prevented it. So, is there a minimum threshold of governance and administrative capabilities, or is there a particular configuration of local civil society that enables smart governance innovations to be introduced or used? that could really drive improvements in service delivery or democratic participation or whatever the aim is. Maybe there is, and it's looking for what those minimum capabilities are, or that governance environment, and then looking at pockets of efficiency and effectiveness. And I'm sure you know Matt Andrews' work on problem-led approaches that build from an analysis of what the problem is and uses that to arrive at the kind of solutions that you would be looking for in the local African or any other context. So just a last word on your ideas for using culture as a tool. I think this could have value if culture is understood as in quite a complex way, not as something fixed, but as shaped by, the complex interactions of multiple institutions and resource environments, including resource scarcity and the distribution of power, etc., and not, as something abstract. So, for example, if you were curious to explore the concept of Ubuntu, because that's the one I know as a South African more than some of the others mentioned, as a framework for experimenting with new forms of networking or collaboration, perhaps first one needs to show how Ubuntu empirically is existing in public administrations or in the interface between officials and local citizens in their interactions in municipalities. So what it's really about working, I think, empirically from the ground up, rather than trying to apply an abstracted concept to an environment that has already been very tangibly shaped by all sorts of institutions and a lot by power and sort of resource scarcity. So, I mean, my sense is that your sense is at the beginning of mapping a potentially very important project. There's very little work and funding for locally informed and generated theories and practices of public administration on the continent. So I think it's fabulous. As I say, if it's something that's informed by working from the ground up and really generating a strong empirical sense through particular case studies or countries that you really want to focus on, then I think it could be really meaningful. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Really insightful, very valuable comments. My suggestion is we start with the next discussion, and then we kind of might respond to all of them and then open the discussion.
Yes, I think it's a good idea, Mamdin. Yep.
Perfect. So Anne, I would pass over to you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. I would like to congratulate Emendine and all his colleagues at the University of Bern and the University of Middlesex and Mauritius in taking the initiative in creating the Centre for African Smart Public Value Governance. As our previous speaker, Sarah, has implied, there doesn't seem to have been much work that is creative and looking at new ways of looking at what public governance might involve. And the aim, as I understand it, is to look at the grand challenges facing the world today, as evidenced by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, through exploring what managerial and organizational perspectives have to offer in terms of providing insights and strategies into how these may be tackled in both practical and theoretical terms. And this, as I think Sarah has already indicated, involves moving away from very normative, abstract approaches that operate from the top down. It recognizes the need to engage with the particularities or specificities that inform sites of action, taking account of the contextual context in which they find themselves, paying attention to their socio-cultural context and their economic and political dimensions. In other words, applying a more nuanced approach that does not adopt solutions based on the premise that there can only be one solution to these challenges, or that one size fits all. And this is especially the case when dealing with challenges facing the African continent, where there has been a tendency to apply Western theories and forms of implementation without taking due account of what this means for the African context in which they are applied. I'd like to focus on three areas for discussion in relation to the Centre's approach to smart government and public value governance. And these are: one, the role of networks and collaboration; two, the sources of data and the methodological perspectives that underpin proposed solutions. And 3, the importance of understanding institutional frameworks and constraints, especially when engaging with multidisciplinary perspectives. And I'll start with number 1. The notion of collaboration, or what as I, as an anthropologist of law, would term clusters or networks, is important. And this is because our notion of governance is no longer limited to or centered only on state institutions and actors alone. For as Rose and Miller observed as long ago as 1992, and I quote, "The question is no longer one of accounting for government in terms of the power of the state, but in ascertaining how and to what extent the state is articulated into the activity of government. What relations are established between political and other authorities? What funds, forces, persons, knowledge, or legitimacy are utilized? And by means of what devices and techniques are these different tactics made operable?" Definitely a move away from any one idea of what government would entail. And the world in which we currently operate involves an understanding of globalization, not as a homogeneous whole, but in looking at and recognizing that governance employs policy arrangements that emerge outside the administrative system of a single nation state government, but which, nevertheless, have a comparative impact on a globally or regionally designated set of past recipients. It reflects an increasing variation in the functions of governing and to the diversity of institutional levels and actors that are included. And this is one that requires an understanding of the creation and deployment of a whole range of technologies connecting multiple centers of power. Now, in my own work in Land on Botswana, I've engaged with networks that not only involved government ministries and staff and district government personnel, but autonomous institutions such as landlords, non-governmental organizations, and families and households. Through looking at the threads that connect them or that create tensions between them, I was able to highlight the differing dimensions of power that were at work at multiple levels, and also to make visible the power of norms that are not legal regulations, but that are highly influential on the ground, but because they're not described of as law, often remain hidden from view. Being able to uncover what these things entailed enabled me to gain a perspective on what transformations were taking place on the ground and their differential impact on different populations. So understanding what networks are involved in the various challenges that arise, such as poverty eradication, climate change, public health management, is crucial to finding solutions that work on the ground. And this knowledge also contributes to theory building, providing alternatives to long established theoretical perspectives. And this brings me to my next point, looking at sources of data and methodological perspectives. Because what data underpin the models that are applied to understandings of smart government and public value governance? It is essential to comprehend what is underpinning policies that derive from theories applied, for example, to sustainable development goals and the distribution of international aid. How the UN, World Bank, and IMF approach their assessment of how to tackle global challenges cannot be taken for granted. The underlying basis on which their governance framework is based, however, is rarely questioned. However, where there are failures in the achievement of sustainable development goals, they are simply, to quote the report for the Center for International Governance Innovation, and I quote, attributed to the people, systems, and governments of the global South or sub-Saharan Africa. And this attitude is inferred in observations such as the following from the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor that says, sub-Saharan Africa is not on track to achieve any of the Millennium Development Goals, and extreme poverty persists on every continent. Now, this assumption is founded on a Western construct, grounded in aggregation and averages that fail to address the needs of the very poorest. Indeed, as Robert Home has noted, neoliberal aid and policies that include land titling as a precondition, for example, of World Bank structural adjustment from the 1980s, hardly address what they claim are the basic inequalities in ownership and access to land. The failure to take account of existing inequalities in the South often leads to misguided assertions such as, again to quote from this central government's innovation report, Mozambique is way off track despite strong improvements. Co-host Sebastian Amanor and Sam Moyo argue that what is required is an analysis of structural interests, access, and equity in addressing questions of sustainable development. And I think that is something that you at the Centre are keen to try and get beneath, to look at what are the structures that exist and how could we improve them. Now, the assessments that I've just referred to are usually based on a form of monitoring that is applied to countries across the globe. This kind of monitoring represents a type of governance that is based on statistics, a model of accountability that is often referred to as the audit culture that is transnational in scope. It represents a results-based approach to management centered on a set of techniques applied on an international scale to rank states' progress in relation to one another. The most obvious example of the audit culture is demonstrated by the World Bank and other international agencies' ratings and rankings of countries comparatively in terms of calculations of gross domestic product, which, to quote Sally Engel-Merry, is one of the most widely used and accepted indicators of national standing. Along with indicators evaluating the rule of law or the Human Development Index, these indicators are used to rank countries, especially in terms of GDP, as developed or less developed. Now, this immediately creates a top-down hierarchy. As Mary has argued, and I quote, this growing reliance on indicators provides an example of the dissemination of the corporate form of thinking and governance into broader social spheres. Thus, corporate forms of governance become more widely applicable and mark a transfer of power from the state to organizations, as evidenced by the audit explosion, an idea which has become embodied in a wide range of programs for accountability and control. As part of this process, indicators are a technology not only of knowledge production, but also about governance, for they are used to manufacture evidence-based policy, feeding into what Mary refers to as results-based management, that is often taken for granted, but the basis upon which it is based is never really fully examined or taken into account. And I'll give you an example from Botswana. It's often said that Botswana is one of the least corrupt countries in the world. But I discovered that the basis upon which this internationally constructed idea and assumption has to do not with investigation, but self-certification. As cases of corruption above £20 sterling have to go to a government department where they often conveniently disappear, this proof of lack of corruption is highly suspect. So the danger of this monitoring or audit culture that I have outlined is that it only presents one side of the picture, and it does not allow for alternative perspectives to take root. And I think this is what your centre is striving to provide for. It is not possible to list all the alternative ways to perceiving and carrying out research, but I think an earlier participant in a webinar talked of thinking of this in terms of process, looking at what are the processes, and I would endorse this view. What are the processes that we need to put in place to challenge dominant perspectives? How can we create space for alternatives? How can collaborative participation become meaningful? And I think Sarah has already suggested that one way is working from the ground up and doing empirical in-depth studies. However, this notion of collaboration does require a word of caution. And I'm thinking here of Martin Weilemann's work on project law in the context of international development and cooperation. I think it's very instructive. He explores at an institutional level the lawmaking capacities of development projects and of international and national development agencies. And it's based on his practical experience as an advisor to the German Agency for Technical Aid. And he traces how project ideas are turned into feasible development plans through chains of translation. These weave through executive policy-making agendas, international rules of negotiation, and finally to the practices of local partner organizations. What emerges from his approach is a view of legal plurality that is not confined by territorial or geographic markers relating to the state or formal legal rules, but rather is multidimensional in nature and derived from networks or webs of relation that in terms of local populations often operate to disempower them. Thus, their collaboration is not truly participatory. His empirical research addresses a more nuanced understanding of the hidden nature of power, how it is constructed, and how it operates beyond the level of the state. And it is important to understand its workings when looking critically at African states and their limitations and constraints. This is especially the case where one of your webinar participants, I think, talked about the European Union and the emphasis on having less formal legal regulation, implying that more administrative norm making might be the way forward. But one has to be aware of what power is at work here. And if it is not formal law, the power of the norms that are at work, as they are in Weileman's project law, may remain invisible and undiscovered and not be taken into account. So one has to be very careful in looking at where power is located and how it is constituted. I have found in my own work that working with the concepts of space and time have been helpful in decentering predominant paradigms. And I use these concepts in my recent book, Transformation on the Ground, Space and the Power of Land in Botswana, to challenge dominant narratives about access to land and land reform. In my case, land embodies a space that not only embraces a grounded, physical and territorial place, but also represents a more intangible universe, where space is viewed as the product that embodies social relationships with intersecting dimensions. These make it clear, as Lefebvre has observed, that space cannot be divorced from ideology or politics because it cannot be viewed as a natural medium that stands outside of the way in which it is conceived. Adopting this particular perspective on space allows for diverse interpretations of how relations to land are constituted, and importantly makes visible the ways in which they may vary, complement, overlap, or even come into conflict with one another and with the broader completing global perspectives that are in operation at any moment in time. Now, time and space are intertwined to differing effect. On the one hand, adopting a linear approach to time with the goal of annihilating certain types of space. And on the other, by making time subservient to space in the recognition of social states of being. Thus, the temporal dimensions of space are important. For, to quote Crown and Thrift, space without time is as impossible as time without space. So that temporality forms an integral part of space. And this relationship exists because human behavior, including the realm of law, is located in and constructed of space that is linked through time to human experience. As such, it involves a plurality of spheres that, as Fabian demonstrates, give rise to a number of different interpretations of time at different moments in history. This approach to interpretation allows for a multiplicity of perspectives rather than endorsing a singular perception based on a linear notion of time and space that operates to the exclusion of all others. For example, international agencies rank countries, as I pointed out earlier, as developed or developing on the basis of certain techniques that measure GDP, etc. Yet as Massey, the social geographer, observes, and I quote, where space represents that dimension of the world in which we live, it is one within which distinct trajectories coexist. This perspective of co-trajectories, however, is negated by ranking countries on a hierarchical basis. For by classifying a country as developing, the country is no longer viewed as being on a par with developed countries. And thus, even though it exists simultaneously in space, in terms of time, it is, and I quote Massey, a country which is following our path to becoming a developed country like us. In employing this form of categorization, I quote her, we are denying the simultaneity, the multiplicity of space, and turning all these differences into a single historical trajectory, one that is based on a linear notion of progression. This vision of an assumed natural order must be contested, for it represents a linear time that presides over the Western logic of developed countries based on a linear conception of development, according to which different pasts converge in a single future. And this must be challenged, according to De Souza Santos, by acknowledging, and I quote, a pluralistic conception of time based on the idea there are alternative development paths and that there are therefore different pasts that underlie different presents that may lead to different futures. I'd now like to work on to talk about institutional frameworks and multidisciplinary perspectives. In focusing on forms of governance and government, it is essential to understand the institutional frameworks on which they are based. And this involves digging beneath their external appearance, projecting their aims and aspirations, to uncovering the reality below. For example, the external face of government in relation to Botswana is one that presents a unified and coherent front. This is one that projects integrity, openness, transparency, accountability, excellence, teamwork, professionalism, and timeliness. This expression of values, of course, is very much in accordance with those promoted by international agencies in connection with the global drive for good governance and access to justice and sustainable development goals. In delving beneath the surface, however, my empirical research on land with regard to the institutional frameworks involved in its regulation presented a much more contradictory and internally differentiated image. And this came about because of the varying interests of the different institutional bodies that are at work, their differing jurisdictions, involving central, district, and local institutions that reflect varying priorities that are at work in them. And these give rise to both diverse short and long-term strategies that may contradict one another, create implementations with regard to control. And this is especially the case where multidisciplinary perspectives are at work and where one is seeking to collaborate together. And I'd like to give you an example from my research on the child's voice in legal proceedings. This is a Western example that was carried out in Glasgow and also in upstate New York, a comparative project. And the research focused on the child in need of compulsory measures of supervision due to neglect or abuse or engagement in criminal activity. In Scotland, such children come before a children's panel who operate on the basis that their interventions must be, as you've all heard, in the best interests of the child. And all professionals appearing before the panel, such as teachers, social workers, nurses, police, etc., operate on this basis. However, what this means in practice is open to question. In one case, a child of 10 was before the panel because his mother, who suffered from drug addiction, found it difficult to care for him. The question for the panel was how best to help the child. During the panel, the nurse who was there observed that the mother was high on drugs and was adamant that because of this, the best interest of the child would be to remove him from the home. Her focus was on the medical aspect of the case. The social worker, however, disagreed, saying that the child's grandmother lived up the road, and whenever there were problems, the boy could go to her. There was no need to remove him from the home and put him into care. And her focus was on the broader social dimensions and a broader contextual approach. So in this case, we have two professionals who, due to their training and professional culture involving medical considerations, social context, and ethical codes, disagreed on the course of action that should be taken. And I use this as an example to draw attention to the fact that where multidisciplinary perspectives are in play, it is important not only to acknowledge common ground, but to be aware of their potential limitations and constraints and what gives rise to these, what are the frameworks that create this. And I would argue that the problem is not just in the way in which these institutional frameworks are imposed on the African continent, which is undoubtedly a problem, but goes to the heart of their underlying premises. And it's important to be aware of that. In another context dealing with women and domestic abuse, we have interdisciplinary groups that are working, but the medics are very reluctant to let the police see the medical reports because if the police see that there has been abuse, they are obliged to engage in criminal prosecution. So the kind of ethics of each profession that is at work and what their codes of guidance are, it's very important to understand them. So these are just some of my observations on the centre's paper, but I'll stop now.
Thank you very much. Really valuable. I made a lot.
I've also got a copy of this in writing, if that would be helpful.
That would have been a question. So yeah, that would be definitely really great. Thank you. Yeah, as said, let's move on with Rebecca, and then I think we gladly make provide some answers or reflection on your reflections.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I would like to commend the team for the center and the work that you're doing. I feel it's really novel in the sense that nobody has really been looking at what's working and what's not working and why is it not working. So I really look at your the center as an institution that is set up to sort of resolve those unknowns that we're going. While listening to previous webinars and also reading what you are doing so far and the work that you have written, I basically review it from the vantage point of my research and what I do. And as a researcher in the informal economy, I look at public sector, smart public sector governance, you know, in more of the recipient's perspective. So I have, I will provide my comments basically from that angle. So the informal sector, as Phage and many others have defined, it is economic activity outside state protection. So by definition, you would think the informal sector does not interact with the state or the public sector in any way. But we also see today in a lot of the work that is going on that actually the informal sector is not necessarily a dichotomy of formal and informal, but rather a continuum where we have some economic activity that actually in fact interacts with the state. And we see that there is a very intricate kind of interaction with the informal sector and the state. So given that background, what I really like about what you're doing so far is the fact that you're focusing on diverse perspectives and creating knowledge from you know, different angles to get in there. So I like the conversation on, you know, the smart public governance and then the African context, and I felt that is creating a really good niche. Of course, not to say that the topic is very interesting. I also like the fact that you were very sharp, I could say, to recognize the role of language. When you talk about the creolization and all that, the role of language in an African setting is very important. And as I will try to elaborate going forward, but thinking about something like Ubuntu, it's having come from an ethnic group that moved from, you know, Southern Africa way to East Africa and some parts of Central Africa, that makes the language become the unifying factor of those communities and not necessarily the national boundaries. So that that is already, I think, something you should be happy to tag on as you get into further interrogation of the issue at hand. So how I really understand the issue is it's not so much in the danger that Western theories might fail to account for local context, but rather they actively alter the context by triggering attempts by various actors to reshape the local reality. And in that way, that becomes a danger because they cause one, disruptions, and then also they undervalue or underestimate the indigenous histories that are within this context. So looking at the situation like that, I would say the team should take a step back to be sure that what you're actually evaluating is really looking into how these Western theories are implemented or prescribing what's going on locally, or how what's locally being done is ignored because of the new Western thought or Western perspectives in getting into that. That said, there are parts of the paper that I wonder, when I hear the word Africanization, I'm not, the first time I have heard or I hear people say Africanization, the question that comes to my mind is it even possible? Because Africa is very diverse. African societies have different institutions and they don't necessarily mean that they're similar all throughout Africa. And therefore, as we get into all this, we also need to be very careful to not think that we are going to bundle up Africa into one box or one thing that works together. And in fact, this becomes more complicated when you look at the African boundaries. As you know, most of the African nations, the boundaries that we have were from the colonialists. And as you see Africa moving on today, you find people working in different spaces. I mean, people are belonging to different countries, but speak the same language. And this still ties in the point of the language that I'm talking about. When you're looking at this whole, or if we want to contribute to this conversation and discussion, the Africanization term, in my opinion, may be bundling up too much or a bit too abstract, and therefore we may lose the value that we would pick from this bottom-up kind of attitude or perspective that you're taking to get into the study. The other thing that I saw as I was listening to your presentation and seeing what it is that you're doing, I'm not very sure. I feel like I miss certain evidence from what it is that you're claiming or what it is that you're saying, or perhaps some empirical data or some anecdotes would be very important in this particular sense. When we talk about smart governance, is it even existing in Africa? And if it is, how so? How is it shaping out? Is it the same in different parts of Africa? Where is it working and where is it not working? When we talk about co-creation, how has it worked and so on? So if we do have a proper mindset of that, then perhaps we would be more articulate into what it is that we want to investigate or what theory we want to change because of this particular perspective. So I do feel that now from the webinar series and the work that you have done so far, coming back into the research agenda, there is a leap, there is a gap that doesn't become very obvious to me. Why is it that we think Ubuntu is going to be a theory that will help us understand smart public governance? You know, we need to be very clear with what evidence is on ground and how this is going to get in there. And this said, like I said, from the informal economy, the informal sector, most participants look at the government or the state or the public sector as the enemy. But they are very organized. They do have institutions that govern them. They have institutions where one person speaks and they're trusted. But when the state comes in, it's issues of, oh, we don't believe this. A very good example I could give you is in Uganda, when the Uganda Revenue Authority got into the e-government system where you had to pay your taxes and everything online. Generally, that's a smart public governance, but it was really received negatively, not because it was not done right, but because the literacy levels of the people in the informal sector was so low, they could not at all manipulate these kinds of innovations. And so the conversation is not really about, are they doing it, but how are they doing it? And then how are they catering for the local environment or the local institutions? So the e-government for so long has struggled in Uganda because the recipients or the users need a lot more to learn to be able to get there. And it's not just about, and that's one of the examples. There could be issues like the infrastructure setup of these societies and many things. And I think the smart public governance, the state now needs to have a more nuanced or critical look at what's working within these local economies and how can we, join to work with these local economies. I think that will be the more useful or more productive way to work with the state. The third and final thing that I would like to talk about with your work going forward is how you select the concepts that you want, or the African concepts that you want to use to further this investigation or this issue. So for Ubuntu, I think many Africans will say, yes, we know Ubuntu, we understand Ubuntu, and it makes a lot of sense. But like I said earlier on, it is a very large group of people that will understand this. And again, that's the language. They will understand this and they will appreciate it. But for example, Asuwada theory and Kotler, for me, it was the first time to see these kinds of theories. And when I think of Botswana as a country, it's probably about 2.4 million people. And when you look at the Africa Broad Stories, we're talking about 1.3 billion people. So, and I'm not to say that using Kotler would not be that model would not be a useful thing, but to say, would you find other similar setups with different names within Africa and call them, and at least relate them on a way that every other person can understand? Because when it becomes too localized, again, it's not something you can lift bottom up and diffuse to other parts of the country. But I would also like to encourage you as researchers or as people working in this project to also think about some concepts that don't necessarily always paint a positive picture. And not that I'm saying the positive picture is a wrong story, but I think the reality also needs to come up. Like I say, from the informal sector, many times when public sector services were brought up or there were any governance issues, in Swahili, there is a word that people say maneno maneno, meaning those are just words, and knowing that the state it's not going to be serious and so on. Some of these negative connotations, people use them to say, okay, should we adapt or should we repel? Should we use this into our system or should we run away from this? And some of those concepts, they actually run all over many parts of Africa. And also those concepts can help us understand why some policies work more than others, why some innovations are more useful or more welcome than others. And that way, I feel would be a good way to still build onto the theoretical understanding of this whole issue of smart public governance. So I will stop there for now. And I want to say again, thank you so much for an interesting study or piece of idea that you have.
Thank you very much. Also, I took again many notes. Yeah, I think we respond. Maybe Adila, I don't know, you.
Yeah. Thank you so much to each of our discussants for this valuable feedback, and it's very thorough as well. And when I'm going through my notes as well, for the point you've made, there are overlaps in some of the comments for us to address. And also there are some questions you have asked and you have challenged us. And when I think about it, Amar, Imamdin and I, we have actually talked about them when we were discussing the subject, but we had not shown them enough in our paper. Completely agree. And as I say, that's as we say, that was the intention as well of today's webinar, to be able to improve on the work that we are doing and enhance the future direction that we want to give to the center. And one question, one feedback that was very common among our free speakers, namely on, yes, we are offering this idea of how to do, to go forward, but actually we haven't emphasized enough what's our problem statement. Both Sarah as well as Rebecca as well, you've mentioned that. So the central issue and the point as well of evidencing the claims that we are proposing around the digital divide and the lack of efficiency as well, or where it's working as well. This is something that we need substantiating. And this brings me to the point as well by Anne on the point on the sources of data that we are looking at, and namely that we cannot take Western produced data for granted about the way that they talk about developing countries. Indeed, we have looked at the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, and I was just opening that document, and one of the data that we looked at was on public administration. And yes, to echo the comment by Sarah as well, there is a digital divide, but there is a bridge as well in the gap that we are observing. So in terms of infrastructure in Africa, there are improvements worthy of acknowledging. And now that brings us, so these are improvements that the data are suggesting, but there are gaps as well on the field in terms of how the public sector is operating, that yes, we need to substantiate further in our essay and to show more in depth as well in our writing. And on the point as well on empirical data, empirical evidences, so, and case studies, rather case studies. Case studies and the choice of case studies as well that we want to bring forward. And indeed, that's something that we have to look at. And in fact, there are several activities that we have done for the center. And we have applied for grants as well for looking at the Mauritian context and the digital divide. That was something that a project that we worked on in the initial stages of our project. And yes, we were hoping to get a little bit of, based on the project that we were doing, to get a little bit of data. That project didn't work, but there are others as well that we are trying to bring forth. So I'm saying that yes, indeed, a case study and one which is relevant to our field. Why Mauritius as well is because according to the data, there is, in terms of public administration, there are suggestions that it's improving. Nevertheless, there are areas as well that it is lagging behind or stagnating. And we wanted to question that. And of course, related to the governance model as well that we have here, which was one of the points raised on the grounded a sense of the structure and the blockages, obstacles for democracy and governance models. So indeed, that is something in the works for us and perhaps at some point in the future. But agreed completely, in our AC, we need to make our problem statement more, clearer. We need to make it clearer, and in order to substantiate the claims that we are offering, the suggestions that we are offering, we really, really appreciate the feedback. I know I'm only touching on a few of the points now, but it's indeed a lot, and we really appreciate it. And these are definitely things that we'll be working on in the final version of the AC. And yes, on the topic of Africanization as a word, indeed, it's not ideal to sort of put everything together under one umbrella expression. And in fact, perhaps that's something for Mamdin and Amar for us to discuss, whether an African-led approach or making it clear by what we mean by an Africanization of the field that we are looking at. And something very interesting as well by Anne yes, it's good to acknowledge common grounds among the disciplines. Thank you for that example, by the way, on laws related to the child and so on. It's so it's a pertinent one, but also acknowledge the limitations of an interdisciplinary approach. So that's not something that we have discussed at all. So that's some food for thought for us, and definitely that's something that we'll be taking on board. So as I said, I'm only touching on the feedback on the few points, but it's a lot, and we can't thank you enough. And it's really, really valuable comments that we will be taking on board. So Imamdin and Amar, so that's it from me. I'm sure I have other things to say, but we can discuss further. But or if you would like to address the comments.
Yeah, first of all, I also just want to say again, thank you very much for these really valuable inputs. There are really many, and some of them I also need to digest first. But yeah, it's really cool, and they will definitely help us. I also just want to touch some of the points, and unable to touch everything. That kind of should be an answer to all of the three discussants. So first of all, the idea is really to kind of rate an essay and providing a research agenda. So in this piece in itself, whatever will happen with it, we are not kind of aiming to collect any data. Nevertheless, it made me thinking that we still have to address it, and kind of, if we think about an outlook, also need to think about an outlook. Okay, what does it mean about if you want to do empirical research, what kind of research, in what context? And I think there Anne has already provided some really good examples when we think about, okay, understanding the networks that are played, the power, where's the power playing, so to focus on that. And I think that's definitely something we will have to take into account. Something also saying is about the really aim that we have is in that sense not to say to implement smart public value governance and see kind of what are the lacks that exist exactly from a certain perspective, and rather, as actually before said, understanding what are the place, what are the institutions at ground, and on this basis think about public management approaches, ideas from different contexts in order to address them. So in that sense, I for example, I made a lot of notes of some key terms that you were saying. For example, when you talk about the concepts of space and time, to consider that in further depths, take this into consideration, is definitely something that makes sense, and I think we should also address. I also like kind of these terms that you mentioned about audit culture. It's exactly things we had in mind, and you just label it perfectly. So also this is already really helpful. And I also agree with your concerns, Rebecca, that you were saying about the Africanization. I completely agree. I mean, we always say, of course, we have it in our center's title, and of course always say that they're really different. So of course there's no generalization, and I agree we should be careful in the way we want to use it. But I also really liked your idea of kind of thinking about negative concepts, negative approaches, what exists there, how on that basis we can develop new ideas, new knowledge that can be useful also from a practical perspective. Yeah, so there are really, as said, a lot of thoughts that came up, a lot of inputs. I want to say thank you. I say that I still need time to completely digest it and bring it, but I will definitely take this time, or we will definitely do it. So thank you very much. I think that's really valuable for our work. Amar, do
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, so just following on from what you've been saying, so yeah, that point about the Africanization, it's almost like we try to apply the one size fits all there as well. So we do need to be careful with how we approach that, and using culture as a tool. What sparked my interest from the digital side is I'm quite keen now to exploring more so where smart government tools have worked and how it's worked and the approach that's been taken, whether it's been something that's done in-house, and how do we close that digital divide, that gap there? Is it a case of, there's all these innovative tools that are out there and there's different ways of deploying them, but we have all these issues around literacy. I don't know if it's a case of maybe this is where all these technologies around artificial intelligence can help to close the gap, having conversational agents that can kind of guide people towards where they don't have to be so exposed to using mobile phones or PCs and laptops. So I'm quite keen to exploring where it's worked and how it's worked, and which countries, and which directions we should be going in order to close that kind of gap. So thanks very much for everyone's input, particularly with the digital side of things, because that's where my interests lie. Thank you.
Yep. So thank you, everyone. Amandine, should we invite questions from our attendees? So anyone online who would like to challenge us, ask us questions, we are all ears. Feedback, we really appreciate it.
or if you have comments, I've seen there were two comments also in the chat. I don't know if you want to address them still in the audience, or also among the discussants. I don't know if there's anything.
I have a dramatically stupid because simplifying suggestion. What I understand from the presentation are these, I think it was the last slide, those three worldviews, theories. I couldn't grasp exactly what those refer to. Points of view, perspectives, cultural perspectives. That triggered in me the following idea, and that might help you in framing and maybe specifying what the center is about. So here's my shorthand definition of public value, and it goes back to, I think it's Mark Moore's definition, but it might be Timo Meinhardt's adaptation in the European context. And his shorthand definition of public value is what the public values. Now, if that's the shorthand definition, that is a great launching pad, because you can specify what in your particular context constitutes the public, and how do those publics go about valuation of some kind, the public good, the public service, whatever is the object of that valuation. So with that very simple definition, you can actually use that as a launching pad to specify what's the public in that particular context of study, and what are the valuation processes that are context specific, culture specific, language specific. So those are my 50 cents on that one.
Yeah, valuable 50 cents. So I think they were Bitcoin cents. And yeah, anybody else still something to raise, to comment? Yeah, Guy, you're raising your hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you
we
hear
can.
me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I would like to support us and precisely to share two things in regard of many things. I would like to focus first of all on what I'm aimed to do, and one thing is in a collaboration with Amandine. I'm interested to work with him. First of all, I'm a PhD student in management in France. Along that, I'm a senior consultant at the World Health Organization, as well as the World Bank, with a PharmD degree. The idea is coming back to Ubuntu and public value management. One of the ideas is to check leadership in regulation, and in a context I sent a little message in the chat concerning the fact that the African Union is more and more talking about Ubuntu, and the idea could be to see two things: the leadership aspect behind Ubuntu, and the context will be definitely African Union, but particularly regional economic community with a focus in the pharmaceutical sector. Having said that, this will be able, because my research for the PhD is about agentification and digitalization, which means in regard of the public, new public management, I'm focusing on how to build strong institutions through agentification and digitalization. So to summarize, I wanted to support some of the project. I mean, to talk about some of the project that may arise in the future, thanks to CASP, and particularly with Amandine, sorry, which is two things to summarize. Ubuntu, I aim to do some research on Ubuntu and in regard of public value, and secondly, agentification. Over.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Sarah, you're raising your hand too?
Yes, I was just, I don't know, you're at the beginning of establishing the center, so I assume, budget is not endless. And, this question of empirical work, if you don't have the budget perhaps, or the immediate focus is not going to be on doing that yourself. I mean, there is enormous amount of case study work from which you can draw. I was thinking, for example, of that network Participedia. I don't know whether you know it. It's run from Canada with Canadian funding, but has collaborators all over the world who are developing case studies of kind of innovations in local public participation mechanisms and accountability, some of it using smart government, citizen-based monitoring apps and that kind of thing. I just think whether it's secondary sources of empirical data you're using or your own, I think it's central, because I think that the conversation can otherwise remain at a highly abstracted level. So, and I think that's true sometimes of the study of public administration in the global north as well. Sort of, there's an idea, if we do the following should happen, because we posited it as a good idea, but it isn't actually happening. With new public management, if we decentralize, we will have the following outcomes, but often we didn't. So I think that you could draw on other case studies. For example, the previous colleague on the interest in agentification, there's some amazing studies on the setting up of agencies and what, the extent to which they were able to sort of insulate from, or develop a clearer and insulated development mandate. And, so there's lots to work from, even if you're not going to be doing that. And perhaps from what I'm hearing, in a way, your interest is more perhaps on the cases that have worked than the structural conditions for explaining why it often doesn't. And that's maybe a method. Maybe your method is informed by that. So you're looking for stories of these little examples where they have worked, and you can start connecting the dots of the sort of institutional conditions for that, and then returning to theory and your idea of public value governance.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Another very valuable feedback. So indeed, that could inform our methodology. Thank you so much.
Any other comments, questions, or whatever? Something to raise? I think otherwise as it's already 2 hours past, we just go to the end. Oh, we have Ki, you still raise your hand again?
Yes, I have a question.
Please.
Because you are talking more and more about women, and not forgetting that the Women's Day was like the 8th of March. But probably I'm wrong, but I did not really see, I don't know how to say that, but women are supposed to be more and more involved with not only the business, but public management. I don't have an insight coming from you for something that could be done concerning, yes, women in that context of public management. To make it simple, yes, how about the genre we say in French, but how about, yes, that aspect of the women inside this whole concept of SPMV. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
I think it's definitely very valuable to think about it, and important. Maybe I'm taking now the words by Klaus, who said kind of we have to raise the question what the public is, and of course need to emphasize also it's independent of gender, of ethnicity, age, whatever, and I think that's exactly the important question in a way, that to make sure that involvement exists beyond any frontiers. Yeah.
So Guy, absolutely. This is something that we can continue further through the work that we do and look at in another project, or consider as well as a start. But yeah, agree with Emamdin and with Klaus' question as well. What is it that we are concentrating on? And in the context here, what we constitute the public, and of course, where are the gender dimension is it as well, is something that we can continue in further discussion as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you.
I guess we go to our last slides. I pass on to Adila at the beginning.
Yeah, very briefly, thank you so much to our three discussants. And we have a small budget from Middlesex University, Mauritius. We are very thankful for that. And we are really pleased that we can share with our discussant a voucher on Amazon. So that will land in your email inbox tomorrow on the 17th of March. So we thank Middlesex University, Mauritius for the budget that we have, and for the opportunity that actually we can say thank you to our discussant, because it's the time you have taken to be present today, to read through our work, and for the valuable feedback. We cannot put a monetary value on the feedback, and we will be digesting the comments, but hopefully this tiny gesture can help us thank you and to say how we really appreciate you. So and the feedback that you have provided. Thank you so much. So to Sarah and Rebecca, thank you.
Exactly. Thank you also again from my side. And we just want to raise awareness to kind of a scholarship opportunity called the Swiss Government Excellence Scholarships for Foreign Scholars. So when you are from particular countries, there exists a list of countries, and you have a research idea, there's a possibility to come to a Swiss institution as a PhD or postdoc. And so kind of what we want to say, if you have some ideas about research around these topics that we're raising here, please feel free to approach us, and maybe we can find a way to develop such a proposal and help you if such a scholarship could be an option for you. Amar?
Yeah, I just want to highlight this annual meeting at the Academy of Management, which I understand is happening early August. They will be running a professional development workshop, decolonizing management and organization studies. This is co-organized with CAS and will be co-chaired and will be participating in there. So you can see we'll be looking into why we should decolonize management studies, and look to suggest some approaches to take in terms of things like theoretical concepts and methodologies. And you can see here we've got quite a wide, diverse range of participants from a number of universities all across the globe. So that's worth penciling in if you can, if you're able to attend such a meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, just want to add also here with I connect what Anne was saying about space and time. We have exactly two inputs here also by Anna Kim and Garima Sharma, who really exactly elaborate how the concept of time and place space could be as a useful theoretical concept exactly to theorize management organization studies from a non-Western concept, or to better respect kind of the local concepts. So we are still waiting for the acceptance. We are optimistic, but we still have to wait if the PDDW will be really accepted. Another event we want to raise your attention is we're planning a virtual paper development workshop co-organized with the African Journal of Management and the African Academy of Management on the topic of tackling grand challenges from an African perspective. So if you have any project ideas going on, then that could be an option exactly to elaborate them further. We don't have a date yet. Probably it's going to be in the second part of the year. We definitely will let you know, but that you already have that in mind in case this could be an option for you. And Adila, I think. So.
Yes, your ideas, anything, any feedback, we highly value your comments and feedback. And we have social media platforms as well where you can follow us. And we will be sharing this video over YouTube. So if you are watching it and if you would like to discuss with us further, we welcome your input. And actually it has worked. We've had a growing network of with our attendees. And thank you to everyone who is sharing the work that we are doing. In fact, we are having emails as well about colleagues wanting to connect with us and the work that they are doing. And they are, we really appreciate the network that we are creating. Yes, Jelena, to answer your question, we do have social media links on the next slide. We have a web page now, which is very fresh from about a month ago. And we have a LinkedIn page and a Twitter account as well. And if you wish to contact us via email, our email address is available on the web page, and on the next slide as well, I think we have our contact information if you wish to contact us in the traditional way through the post. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and exactly, if you have kind of ideas, if there's something you'd like to present, anything, a project, then please feel free to approach us. And we understand this as a platform, so anything that goes around these topics, we're happy to support these ideas also.
Yeah. Just a final point, in case anyone is wondering what the photo on the slide that we have is, it's actually the new Supreme Court in Mauritius. Oh. So that's actually a photo that it's an original photo that we had permission to use, and we are able to use it in our PowerPoint slides. It's if you wish to visit Mauritius, that could be one of your places to visit if you wish, in the city center.
Yeah, the picture was taken by her brother. That's why we have the copyright. and who takes really great pictures. I also like them on Facebook, just to mention that. And yeah, so yeah, thank you again for being here, for raising questions, and thank you again for the inputs by the discussants. And yeah, we're looking forward to hear you again somewhere in whatever occasion.
Thank you very much for your paper and the center. Look forward to seeing how it develops.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and best of luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I think that went quite well there.
Okay, good. We are still recording, sorry.